The first civilians evacuated from these steelworks in the besieged Ukrainian city of Mariupol are reaching safety. More than 100 people have managed to get out of the port and are being bused across the front line to Ukrainian-held Zaporizhia. Now, hundreds of others are still waiting to leave. Ukrainian authorities say some 100,000 people remain in Mariupol. The city is now almost entirely in Russian hands, with conditions described as desperate. Elsewhere in Ukraine, both military targets and civilians are coming under fire.
A Ukrainian rocket making quick work of a Russian patrol boat in the Black Sea. Rockets and shells continue to rain down on targets on both sides of the conflict. Here in Lyman, in the Donetsk region, civilians are once again among the dead and injured, as their homes are caught in the crossfire. Unfortunately, there are losses among the civilian population. As of now, we know of 2 deaths due to the shelling. Around 100 kilometers away, in Mariupol, there has been some relief for the people entrenched in the Azovstal steelworks. According to the Russian military, 126 people were able to flee during a lull in the fighting. Buses operated by the Red Cross and private vehicles took them to safety. Initial reports indicate around half chose to go to Russian-controlled territory, with the rest seeking safety in Ukrainian-held areas. Meanwhile, American diplomats have returned to Ukraine. They've set up operations in Lviv and have a strong message for Russian President Vladimir Putin.
I would say the message to Russia is you failed. Ukraine is still standing, the government is still functioning, and we're going back to Lviv first and then Kyiv to help the government.
There they will join their Hungarian and Danish colleagues who have already resumed their diplomatic missions in the Ukrainian capital.
And our correspondent Emmanuel Chaz is in Lviv. Emma, we've been following this evacuation of civilians from Mariupol. What can you tell us about how that operation is going?
Well, 100 people managed to make it out of the Azovstal steel plant, and we've been hearing some of their testimonies. They've been sharing what it was like to live in that power plant that was constantly, that steel plant that was constantly being shelled by Russian troops. There's a woman who said she had been living in underground for 2 months. She hasn't seen the sunlight for 2 months. Many people said that there was a lot of people who were still in the steel plant. 500 civilians, at least, among them many children. So they had a very tough experience during those 2 months. They are all, of course, traumatized by this experience. Some thought that the bunker they were in wouldn't resist to the constant shelling. They feared that they would eventually lack of food and water. So a traumatizing experience. And you see this green corridor that has been agreed upon, also thanks to the help of the United Nations, where this green corridor also served to some civilians in Mariupol who left the city through that corridor. And the state of the cars, with broken windows, broken doors, and people who had spent those 2 months under heavy, intense shelling just tells you just how desperate the population is to escape for those who still can.
So people emerging in pretty bad shape. Now, you're in Lviv. That is, of course, a major stopping point for refugees, also for internally displaced people. Has the city itself been able to provide enough support for those who are arriving there?
Well, the city has changed so much in those past 2 months. It used to be a very quiet city, like a provincial city, even if it was a big city even before the war. But now it has become, some people tell me, here overcrowded. It's very difficult to find a flat here. You can see, even looking at the cars, most of the cars here are coming from the east, coming from the capital, Kyiv, because there's still a huge amount of people from the capital who who escaped at the very beginning of the war, even if we've seen more and more returns to the capital, not least, diplomacy representatives, also civilians who are returning back home. There's still a lot of people here. I've been talking to internally displaced people as well who don't really know what will happen. They don't know if they will settle here in the West. They don't know if they can already go back home. So it's a city that has completely changed. Some inhabitants were also telling me that now they've been surprised because they're hearing more Russian, because in eastern Ukraine people have been talking majorly Russian. So this is those little changes that you notice here in Lviv.
DW's Emmanuel Chaz in Lviv, thank you so much for your reporting. Now, in the western city of Lviv, where Emma's just joined us from, some schools are virtually empty because so many women and children have fled from their homes to safety. One school is using its classrooms to provide shelter to refugees from other parts of Ukraine. Emma Chaz, who we just saw there, paid a visit.
Since the war started, Ivan Lozensko's Ukrainian-German school in Lviv has drastically changed. Although we meet him on a weekday, there is no child in sight.
Of course, the school has changed a lot, because 43% of the children now live abroad. But they still actively take part in remote learning classes.
The school's premises didn't remain empty for long. With the help of parents and volunteers, Ivan decided to host internally displaced people from the regions worst affected by the war. So far, almost 200 people have stayed here, mostly men, as they are not allowed to leave the country. Volodymyr arrived to the school at the end of March. He fled from Demudov, near Kyiv, carrying only a few belongings, and this paper with him, where he wrote down that after a stroke he couldn't talk very fast and needed immediate evacuation.
We just walked. There was a 50-50 chance to end up dead or alive. We walked through. We walked past the dam, on the road to the bridge, which was blown up by our army. I passed the first Russian checkpoint without problems. But on the second I was stopped and they asked me, "What do you have here?" When I said my cell phone, it was taken away.
Volodymyr sleeps in what used to be the school's main hall, now transformed into a dormitory. There, we also meet Alexandre, who hopes to join the Ukrainian armed forces.
I came alone. My family stayed near Kharkiv. We live in the northern part, closer to Russia, and it's been bombed every day since the beginning of the war. Nearly everyone in the neighborhood left town. I still have to pass a medical check to join the army, and after that, I don't know. I don't have a military specialty, so I'll probably have to train for a few months.
In what used to be classrooms, we meet Mikhailo and his son-in-law Denis from Bucha. Their wives now live in Germany. They have lost all of their possessions and only brought Mickey, the family dog. On the evening of February 28th, Russian soldiers knocked on Denis' door.
Russian troops forcibly removed me from my flat. They came with rifles. They searched me, broke my mobile phones and stole my laptops. They brought me to the nearby church and told me not to come outside until sunrise. They set up their military position and their artillery. There's only me and 2 other men. In the morning, we left and settled here.
In his school, Ivan provides some relief to fellow Ukrainians who have lost everything. But those displaced people, and especially men, are left in limbo here in Lviv, not knowing if and when they will be able to return home.
And Varvara Zhlukchenko is communications officer for the UN's International Organization for Migration in Ukraine. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today on DW. The IOM says 1 in 6 Ukrainians are now displaced internally, having been forced to flee their homes. At this point in the war, Are we seeing the situation continuing to worsen?
Good evening. Yes, unfortunately, we see that the displacement is ongoing. The numbers have been growing, and according to our survey, more than half of those IDPs who are currently staying in Western Ukraine intend to move onwards, or they can also return home. And the latter can include areas heavily impacted by the hostilities and where services have been disrupted. So even when back home, these people would still need sufficient assistance.
Now, your most recent report found that the majority of those who are internally displaced are women. What kind of help do they in particular need?
Well, both displaced women and men, first of all, need cash, because many of them are not able to work anymore. They've lost access to income. And the second most pressing need is healthcare and medicines. Vast shares of those displaced have disabilities, approximately 20%, and more than 1/3 have chronic illness.
And have you been able to make contact with those who need help most?
Yeah, we work through a network of our partner NGOs. We work together with the United Nations, with local authorities and Ukrainian government. So there is no problem with access to IDPs, but there is a big problem with access to those people who have been trapped in their native hometowns and villages in the areas where hostilities are ongoing.
Now, the war is also increasing the risk of human trafficking and sexual exploitation. The IOM is working to prevent that. Can you tell us more about what you are doing there?
Yeah, thank you. We are extremely concerned that both women and children who have to escape from the conflict and from the war and flee from Ukraine can fall prey to human traffickers and suffer from sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, forced begging, but at the same time, men who are staying in the country and who don't have their jobs anymore can also become victims of forced labor and other types of exploitation. We are working on prevention together with our partners. Just today, we've launched a big campaign together with the European Union to raise awareness of Ukrainians on the risks of human trafficking.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to share your efforts with us here. Varvara Shlukchenko from the International Organization for Migration on DW News. And I'd like to bring in Wolfgang Richter. He is a former colonel in the German army and a senior associate at the think tank SWP, that is the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. A very warm welcome. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us. The Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov has said Russia is not aiming to declare victory by next Monday, celebrated as Victory Day, as we've heard. Can you tell us your assessment of how the Russian advance in the Donbas region is developing?
Yeah, good evening, Claire. We can observe that we are now in the phase 2 of the operations, as the Russians say, of the military operations in Ukraine. Now they have concentrated on the Donbas. They try to avoid the mistakes they made in phase 1 when they had to retreat from the Kyiv area after heavy losses. Now they concentrate more on operational goals and their structures. The force structures are better suited for the flat terrain between Izium and Luhansk. So they might be able to make some advances. But we are now seeing the second week of this operation, and we can state that they didn't make too much territorial gains so far. The Ukrainians still defend with an admirable spirit of resistance. So I don't see much movements on the ground. The only victory one might declare is the occupation of most of the town of Mariupol, where only a small pocket of resistance still exists. But more or less, the Russians have achieved to establish a corridor between Crimea and the Donbas. And to the western side from Crimea, they had made some advances earlier towards Kherson and towards Mykolaiv, but they failed to conquer Mykolaiv. But obviously the aim was Odessa and even further to the border of Transnistria. So to sum up, the advances are less impressive than thought before. And I think this battle is not done yet, and we have to see how the operations develop. The morale is clearly on the side of the Ukrainians, while the Russians have still good force structures to make some advances in open terrain.
And are weapons that have been provided by the West playing a major role in slowing the Russian advance?
Absolutely, but one should not underestimate the strength of the Ukrainian army when this war started, because it was the second strongest army in Europe, if you don't count Turkey, with at least 1,000 battle tanks in the active forces and 250,000 people in active service. And you have to add then additional more than 100,000 reserve forces. And insofar, on the personnel side, the Ukrainians were anyway not so badly equipped. They had a lot of anti-tank weapons as well and artillery pieces, but of course they suffered losses. And here the Western flow of supplies comes in, and the Western states delivered anti-tank weapons, anti-air weapons, light weapons, first shoulder-fired ammunition, anti-tank mines, drones, reconnaissance drones and combat drones. And only for the last 2 weeks, we are now speaking about heavy equipment, which means howitzers and tanks. And of course, this flow of weapons can, to some extent, replace the weapons that Ukraine has operated so far and have lost. And this might be a compensation for the losses. And I think the stream of, or the flow of weapons will go on.
Now, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has faced a lot of criticism because of a perceived foot-dragging over weapons shipments to Ukraine compared to other Western allies. Germany only agreeing to send heavy weaponry last week. Has this criticism, in your opinion, been justified?
I think it was not justified. It was maybe a question of communication, because from the beginning, Germany delivered the weapons I have just defined and explained. And up to the Easter days, no Western states has delivered Western type or Western style heavy weaponry. What has happened so far was a delivery of Soviet-style weapons from Eastern allies to Ukraine. And in 2 cases, Germany had to give consent to that because we spoke about Estonian howitzers and Czech armored infantry fighting vehicles that were in service with the German National People's Army of the GDR. So Germany had to give consent for that. Germany also provided weaponry to Slovakia and to replace the S-300 air defense system, which was delivered to Ukraine. And the latest one was providing weapons to Slovenia, which sent T-72 tanks to Ukraine. And this is, of course, has some advantages because Ukraine is exactly operating this type of weapons and doesn't need to establish logistical change, spare parts, ammunition, and training, because all that is there. It is much more difficult to provide logistical support and ammunition and training for Western-style weapons, because they are more sophisticated. They are quite different from the weaponry the Ukraine has operated so far, and that means that needs weeks and months even to provide these type of weapons. And only since Easter days, Western states speak about delivering howitzers. Still, we don't see Western-made tanks, heavy or main battle tanks like the Abrams or armored infantry fighting vehicles like the Bradley. The first time we speak about this type of weapons is the discussion in Germany about Leopard 1 and about Marder-type armored infantry fighting vehicles. But as I said, that takes some time to bring them up to shape. They were not maintained so far, so we have to see, are the spare parts enough? What time is needed to bring them in a status that can be delivered? What time is needed for the establishment of the logistical chain, and then, of course, for training for Ukrainian teams.
Okay, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today, but Wolfgang Richter of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, I want to thank you again for taking the time to join us on DW.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you.